of keys and candles. There is power in my family line. My grandmother, who hung you over the door and kept iron nails over the mantel, was revered in her village. After my parents' untimely death, I went to live with her, and she taught me everything I know about the craft. Intention, she always said, whether brewing a potion or performing a rite. Intention is all. Whether you act out of love or hate, vulnerability or fear, the magic will know. I was curious. I loved the craft and all that came with it. I devoured every book in her sizable library and learned the name of each herb and every crystal in her cupboard. During the full moon, I would sleep under the stars, inviting the spirits to enter my dreams and impart their wisdom. But there were powers that grandmother wouldn't let me explore. Some things are best left untouched, she'd say when I pestered her about the greater magics, the deeper sorcery, the darker gifts that lay slumbering in between the cracks of reality. You're young and reckless. When you are ready for such spells, you'll understand why you should leave them alone. I was belligerent, but there was no swaying grandmother. And so, I was left to wonder about the last drawer of her spell work cabinet, which she kept locked at all times, the key on a chain around her neck. When she passed unexpectedly in her sleep, that key came to me. I didn't do much with it at first. I wore it around my neck, under my blouse, like she did. The weight of it was comforting, a reminder that she wasn't completely gone from my life. Those first few months were lonely days. A parade of mourners bearing condolences and casseroles trickled in from the village to get a look at the new queen of the castle. But once their morbid curiosity was satisfied, the visits dried up, and I was left alone in the great, old house. One of the magic's grandmother refused to teach me was piercing the veil. It's always dangerous to open a door to another reality, but it's especially so to open a door across the veil. There are many spirits eager to claw their way in, and it's easy to lose your way when trying to re-enter the living realm. I don't think I would have done it if I'd not been sick with grief. That's the thing about the darker magics, they want to be used, and they can worm their way inside a vulnerable mind. I think that's what's happened. Or maybe it's just what I want to have happened. Whatever the catalyst, I approached the locked drawer. The grimoire was heavy, its power crawling under my fingertips like roaches. It called to me with a sickly sweet voice, urging me to open its covers and partake of its secrets. I should have turned back then. Everything about it felt wrong. All the other magic I'd practiced was warm and filling, like a stew on a winter's day. This was hungry and cold. But I missed my grandmother, and loneliness is a cruel thing. I cleared out a space on the floor and inscribed the runes in pig's blood on the floorboards. Seated inside the circle, I lit the black candle and stared into its flame as I chanted the incantation. The way the book described the ritual, I expected a portal to appear. Instead, everything outside the circle took on an ethereal hue, as if suddenly submerged in water. The air rippled, a current visibly circling my small island of light. It took longer than I care to admit to realize that the ripples, the invisible vibrations flowing through our waking lives, were the souls of the deceased. I caught my breath. One of them, I hoped, was grandmother. Souls tend to linger when someone passes suddenly. There's too much left undone, too many tethers remaining. Perhaps she'd remained with me, unseen and unheard, trying futilely to offer comfort. I sat stock still, trying to differentiate my grandmother's spirit from the rest. If she knew I could see her, perhaps she would reach out to me. "Grandmother?" I whispered, almost afraid to hope. "Grandmother, are you here?" The ripples spun faster, their energy building. I held my breath as they pulled closer and closer until I sat beneath a dome of excited spirits. I'll admit, I was afraid. I'd only dealt with nature spirits before, natural beings who inhabited the trees and water and earth. Being this close to the other world made my hair stand on end, as though my living body were trying to warn me off. Just when I was about to dismiss the spell, a face took shape before me. Translucent and glowing, the wisps of spirit molded into familiar features, slowly revealing the countenance of my beloved grandmother. I'm not too proud to say I wept. All the months of grief seemed to crash into me at once, and I choked on tears as she opened her eyes and smiled. "Grandmother," I said, my words nearly unintelligible. "I've missed you." Her eyes were kind, giving me a gentle look I knew well. Her mouth moved, but I couldn't hear, a fault in the spell, I thought. "I can't hear you." "I'm sorry." The wall of spiritual energy surged, growing in brightness as it took the form of a hand. Grandmother couldn't reach into my ritual circle, but turned her palm upward, inviting me to take her hand. Mesmerized, I reached out, ready to lay my hand upon those luminescent fingers. A scream tore through the house, fierce as a gale, knickknacks rattling on their shelves. "Constance!" I jerked around, face draining of color as I searched for the source of my name. I now believe it was the voice of my actual grandmother, urging me not to fall for the deception. Unfortunately, it was too late. An ice-cold hand clasped mine. I jerked back, trying to tear my hand away, but the grip was hard as steel. The spectral face contorted, my grandmother's familiar smile stretching into something ugly and fiendish. Without thinking, I began the chant of abjuration, a spell grandmother had made me memorize before I was ever allowed to hold a wand or a thame, a simple, yet powerful charm to send an entity back from whence it came. The whirlwind of spirits flickered, wails erupting as the portal began to close. The thing clasping my hand snarled, digging in tighter until my fingers were numb. I spoke faster, fearful of what would happen if the foul thing pulled me through my protective circle, my hand shaking as the cold seeped down my arm. As I neared the end of the abjuration, the spirit screamed. I faltered, stumbling over a syllable before regaining the thread and completing the chant. The house shuddered, the whirling spirits spinning to a dizzying speed, and the candle went out, leaving me in pure darkness. I sat alone and blind for a few moments, waiting for my heart to slow its frantic beating. Everything was calm and quiet, the only sounds were the familiar and comforting creaks of the old house settling. When I was sure I was truly alone, I stood. The spell had drained me, and I wanted nothing more than to climb the stairs and collapse into bed. Not wanting to traverse the steps in the dark, I reached for the nearest lamp, only for my hand to pass through. The Haunting of Apartment 106. Sometimes I hear it scuttling in the shadows or behind the walls. I rarely witness it, but when I do, it's always a blur that disappears into the shadows, and it never happens when I expect it to. I know I sound off my rocker, but there is a monster that lives in my apartment. I first heard its calls 5 days ago, the same day my sister, her husband, and their daughter came over to visit before they left for a vacation. It was the middle of the night when the sound rose from the darkness, freezing my blood. Its call sounded like an orchestra of string instruments being played by gorillas with a propensity for causing as much pain as possible. That was the first in a long series of nights that seemed to never end. The next morning when I got up, I found my chair was torn and the stuffing was partially dragged out. I was physically attacked by this monster the following night while sleeping. The monster plunged its fangs and talons into my feet, attempting to shred my flesh from its bones. I wanted to go to a hospital to have it looked at, but I am afraid of what they may tell me. What if it gave me some kind of disease when it scratched and bit me? After 2 days without sleep, my mind was playing tricks on me. I think the beast enjoys chaos. Returning home, I sometimes find my clothes torn and laying on the floor or the remains of a digested meal. It even knocked over the urn of great-grandma and scattered the ashes. I decided to ask around for help and thankfully found people online. Unfortunately, since I had not seen this beast and couldn't give a description, they couldn't tell me exactly what I would need, but they did recommend that I buy books of wards and rituals. In a New Age shop, I loaded up with everything from charms to Christian crosses in the silver and gold variety, since one may work better than the other. I didn't expect to buy as much as I did that day, but the weight of all the charms around my neck is a small price to pay for safety. People online also recommended that I purchase incense and sage to purge the beast. After performing all the rituals I could and surrounding my bed with salt, I finally felt comfortable enough to sleep. As soon as my head hit the pillow, I was out of it. I don't know how long I was out of it, but when I woke up it was dark. That isn't what woke me though. Something was lying on top of my hip. Its tail was twitching back and forth, slapping my leg, and I was too afraid to move. When my alarm clock went off, the beast ran away. It was the first time I was thankful for having an alarm clock, if I am being honest. When I went to the kitchen, I saw some more of the creature's destruction. This time it decided to tear apart a throw pillow. I am not the kind of person who likes to tell people if I need help, so I didn't tell my friends or family about this, even though I knew that if I did they would offer me a spare bedroom or a couch. Each day I go without sleep, it's as if the shadows get darker and larger. I am not sure if I am going crazy or not. Even as I think this, I wonder, did I just see the beast? Some people online told me about the origin of Halloween and how people would place offerings of milk out for ghosts and goblins to calm them. They recommended that I do the same thing. I set a small bowl of milk out and ran out to buy offerings of meat at the store. When I returned, I saw that the milk had been drunk, so I put out a piece of bologna. I looked away for only a moment, and when I looked back, the meat was gone. These offerings are only a band-aid. I need to identify this monster if I am to have any chance of being free of it. The following night, my blood ran cold when I heard the monster in the walls between my bed and my neighbor's apartment. On the other side of the wall is an old woman who lives all by herself. I should have got up and run to her rescue, but at that moment I was a coward and didn't do anything except cover my head and drown out the sounds with tuneless humming. I rearm all the traps I have set up the next morning and cried because of how useless these traps are and how helpless I feel. It's at this point that I get more glances at the creature. A tuft of hair here, a tail there. Seeing all this, I wish I was never born. I cannot do this for much longer. I am not religious, and I was reluctant to ask a priest for help. However, at this point, I have no other option. He said the church no longer does exorcisms, and that demons are a way to explain the evils in the world and not to be taken literally. When I insist that I am living with some sort of entity, he recommends prayer. I caused a bit of a scene when he said this and stormed off. My friends started to notice how much I had changed and how I was isolating myself, so they reached out to me. I told them everything was fine because I did not want to bother them with my burden. As we speak, I take my time bringing up the possibility of borrowing his gun so I could go duck hunting. Thankfully, he believed me. I do not like being dishonest, but I don't see another way out of this situation. If the tables were reversed and he were to tell me about a monster, I would not believe him. That night I didn't try to sleep. I sat in my bed with the loaded weapon and waited for the monster to show itself. The moment it rears its ugly head, I was going to end its life or die trying. Hours pass, and I think I might have nodded off with the gun in my lap. I wake up suddenly and raise the gun to the door where I thought the beast would appear. I cock the gun, putting a shell in the chamber while at the same time ejecting the one I forgot was already in there. As I pan the gun left and right, waiting for my eyes to adjust, I look for any movement. After a few moments, I see that the wards on the floor made out of salt have been spread all over. I really should not be surprised. The wards offered me no help yet. Why should I expect things to be different now? Feeling pressure on my bladder, I dread getting out of bed when it is dark. Under the bed, the monster could wait for me to put my foot on the floor. I feel like a child all over again, scared of the dark, scared of monsters. In truth, I am afraid of everything. After a silent prayer, I jump off the bed, and as soon as my foot touches the ground, I sprint to the bathroom and shut the door. Unfortunately, I didn't bring the gun with me. Deciding to sit on the cold toilet instead of standing up to urinate, I consider sleeping here with the door shut. Before I know it, I am asleep once again. I woke up to the sound of loud and rapid scratching. In that tiny gap between the door and the floor, I see a white claw reaching out towards me. Needle-like claws extended and excitedly scrape the floor as if it's trying to pull the floor, and me, towards its awaiting maw. A moment later the claw turns and reaches towards the doorknob. I am thankful I am already on the toilet because I scream like a child, and because I don't remember the last time I ate, I faint. When I wake up, it's to the sound of my phone ringing on the other side of the door. As soon as I build enough courage, I burst through the bathroom door and sprint to my bed where the phone and the gun lay. Instead of grabbing the gun, I look at my phone. 4 voicemails and 6 missed calls, all of which were from my boss. He said that I was fired in the last voicemail. This should upset me more than it does, but how could losing a job compare to living with some kind of demon? Forcing myself to eat, I open the fridge and the smell of old spoiled food breaks me. I cry harder than I ever have in my life. Babies don't cry this much. The anticipation of being attacked was almost worse than being attacked. I shout, challenging the beast to reveal itself as my knuckles turn white around the gun. I position a chair in the corner so I can see more of my house, and I wait for the monster. Outside, I hear people go about their day. I hear birds chirp, cars start, and in the distance, I hear a school bell ring indicating that the students are about to go home. Everyone else gets to feel normal. Again, I cry. There was a moment when I thought I heard a woman screaming in the hallway outside, but it ended up being one of those happy screams. I cry yet again. The only time I move from that chair is when I go to turn on the lights just before it gets dark. After all, I need to see the monster to shoot it. If the monster survives the blast, it would kill me. If that is the case, at least this nightmare would be over and I would be able to finally sleep. Weighing the pros and the cons of living, as well as the gun in my hand, I made a decision and put the barrel of the gun in my mouth. Slowly, I apply pressure to the trigger, knowing that at any time this thing will go off and my suffering will be over. I think about the poor bastard who would have to clean this mess for a second, but quickly set that thought aside. As soon as I shoot, it will not be my problem. I add more pressure to the trigger with the business end of the gun in my mouth. My lips tighten on the barrel and I cry more, my finger not easing the tension on the trigger. That was when the phone rang. I pull the barrel out of my mouth on the 3rd ring to see who is calling me. Wiping tears from my eyes, I pick up the phone and see it is my sister who just came back from her vacation. She is the one person who could talk me off of this cliff. Hello? I answer as calmly as I can muster. "Hey, I'm coming over. Be there in 5 minutes," she says. "What? Why?" I ask, surprised. "I'm picking up my cat today. Thanks for watching it when we were gone." The reason why I will never take my son camping again. When my son Daniel first asked me to take him camping, I was a bit surprised. Until then, he had never really shown any interest in such things. It caught me off guard so much, I jokingly accused him of being an alien. After a moment of laughter, he told me the reason for his sudden interest. He said that his good friend Peter had just returned from a camping trip with his dad and had been telling him about all the fun they had. As I listened to this recounting, I could feel my fatherly instincts beginning to boil. There was nothing on my mind aside from destroying Peter and his dad at their own game. I smiled at Daniel and told him that I would take him camping as soon as I got some free time off work. A few weeks had gone by, and I had taken some time off from my job. During my off hours leading up to my mini vacation, I did my best to research all there was to know about camping. I had only gone camping a couple of times as a child, so all the activities involved had been lost on me. There was no way I would let Daniel or, God forbid, Peter find out. However, during all this, my wife Laura decided to just take a step back and not get involved in our little excursion. I called her a coward for not committing herself to the destruction of Peter's family, but that did little to change her stance on the matter. Eventually, the weekend arrived. That Friday, I picked Daniel up from school and took him home. When we entered through the front door, I watched his eyes light up at all the supplies. I had organized a large tent bag, which rested at his feet. Some sleeping bags leaned against the table, and bags of rations, mostly s'mores and snacks, sat near 2 fully loaded backpacks. I asked Daniel if he was ready to brave the wilderness with me, and he nodded with stern resolve. Once we loaded up the car, Laura told me with sincerity to be careful. While I often like to joke about situations, I promised her everything would be fine. Daniel and I both hopped into the car and off we went. During my research, I found a couple of locations to camp at. Daniel had told me earlier that Peter and his dad went camping at the lakeside campgrounds, which were the closest to our town. I scoffed at such an obvious location as if I were some campground expert. Our location would be in a forest, nearly 2 hours north of our town. After answering around a million questions and playing I Spy until images started to blur together, we arrived. We pulled off the road onto a winding stretch of coarse dirt that snaked its way through the trees. Our car bounced and rattled the entire time. Another 20 minutes or so passed before we encountered a clearing. We parked the car off to the side, and Daniel looked at me expectantly. I asked him if he was ready, to which he nodded excitedly. We both stepped out of the car, retrieved our backpacks, and hoisted the tent onto my shoulder. We walked a few meters away from the car and began to set up our campsite. After fumbling with the instructions when Daniel wasn't looking, I somehow managed to erect the tent, but despite my best efforts, it still had a slant on one side. We laid out our sleeping bags in the tent, and I told Daniel to find some sticks to get a fire going. While he was off scrounging for kindling, I skirted the tree line for any loose logs I could use. With our resources acquired, I began the tedious process of starting a fire from scratch. After nearly 20 minutes of failing, I walked over to my car and retrieved a lighter. Within a few seconds, the dry brush caught the flame, and a few minutes later, we had a roaring campfire. I took a moment to appreciate the technology before I called Daniel over. We sat together, making s'mores underneath the changing sky as the sun was beginning its descent. Around an hour after dusk, I told Daniel it was time to sleep, and with a yawn, he nodded. I tapped the smoldering fire with my boot a few times, and the embers began to die out as we climbed into the tent and our sleeping bags. Daniel and I listened to the sounds of the forest around us, the chirping of the crickets, the slight rustlings of the leaves in the wind, and the distant howl of some sort of coyote. Before I knew it, my eyelids had shut, and I had drifted off. My slumber seemed to last only a few seconds when I felt something nudging my shoulder. I cracked open my tired eyes and looked around. Daniel was sitting next to me, staring at me in the dark. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that he heard a noise outside of the tent. With my exhaustion getting the better of me, I told him it was probably just an animal and to go back to sleep. As I rolled over to my side and waited for sleep to take me once again, I heard it. It sounded like footsteps, 2 footsteps walking around our camp. If it were some type of animal, there would have been a gait or rhythm to it, but there wasn't. It sounded like a person walking around. They would take 2 steps, then stop. A minute or 2 would pass before I would hear them walk again. I rubbed my tired eyes and sat up in my sleeping bag. Daniel was lying next to me, but still very much awake. With a whisper, I told him I would take a peek out of the tent to make sure there was nothing there. He returned a slight nod, and I leaned forward. I quietly tugged at the small zipper and peeled it away slowly so as not to make a lot of noise. With the newly formed hole, I brought my eye up to it and looked around. With how dark it was outside and the long extinguished campfire, it was nearly impossible to see anything of note. Still, I scanned around carefully, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had been making that noise. I thought I spotted something moving near the trees, but after blinking my eyes, it was gone. I turned back to Daniel, who was now sitting up and looking at me quietly. I told him there was nothing to worry about and that we should just go back to sleep. As we both lay back down, I heard something that made my hair stand on end, the snapping of a twig directly on the other side of the tent where our heads were resting. I quietly sat back up and retrieved my flashlight from my bag. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and crawled outside. Standing up outside of the tent, I felt a chill from the cold night air wrap around me. I shivered a bit before focusing on my goal. I turned towards where I had heard the noise and switched on my flashlight. The beam of light punctured the darkness, and at first, I saw nothing of note, just the grass and the outline of trees in the distance. Then, it stood up on the other side of the tent. This figure towered above our small tent and, despite me looking directly at it, I couldn't believe that I was seeing it. It was human-like in appearance, with limbs longer than its torso jutting out from the shoulders and hips of its body. Its skin seemed smooth, though it was hard to tell with the amount of dirt covering its body. Its head was nightmarish and massive. It had huge eyes that were set deep into its skull. The eyes themselves were black, but when I shined my light on them, 2 pinpoints of light within the dark eyes reflected at me. Its mouth seemed to stretch across the entirety of its face, like an exaggerated grin. My flashlight shook rapidly in my hand, and I was shivering once again, but this time not from the cold. After a moment passed, I heard a noise that made my heart sink to my stomach. Daniel called out to me, asking if I could see anything. When his tiny voice carried out from the tent, this thing before me twitched and turned its attention to my son's voice, who was still inside of the tent. It seemed like it was drawn to the sound of my son's voice. Its face angled down towards the nylon material. Its smiling mouth began to widen, then its lower jaw dropped nearly a foot long. A row of thin, razor-sharp teeth lined the top and bottom of its mouth. It raised its unnaturally long arm high up into the air, and I realized then what it was going to do. My body reacted on its own, and I reached my hands inside the tent, grabbing onto Daniel, and I pulled as hard as I could. Daniel and I came crashing to the ground as this thing assaulted and tore through our tent. During the onslaught, I helped Daniel by placing my hand over his mouth as his tears began to coat my hand. We stared silently as this thing eviscerated our tent. During this, one of our bags had been sent flying towards us, crashing right next to me. Realizing it was my bag, I reached over and felt through the pockets before finding my car keys. I whispered into Daniel's ear that when I gave the signal to run for the car as fast as he could, despite his distress, he nodded. A few moments after the creature started attacking our tent, a noise drew its attention off into the woods. It turned towards the sound, and that's when I told Daniel to run. We both rose to our feet and dashed towards our car. A deafening shriek filled the air behind us as we ran. Right before we made it, I rapidly clicked the unlock button, and we both entered the car, slamming and locking the doors behind us. I started the car, and when the lights came on, that thing was standing directly before us, an angry grin plastered across its elongated face. I threw the car into reverse, and we backed out of there. I spun the car around in the soft dirt, and we drove the trail back onto the main road, trying desperately not to crash in the process. We didn't stop driving until we made it home. The entire drive, Daniel didn't say a word. He just sobbed quietly in his seat while I struggled not to do the same. Since that day, I've decided to never take my son camping again. I had a nightmare about my ex tonight. I woke up at 2 a.m. from a nightmare about my ex. I have recurring nightmares about him every once in a while. There's a backstory I can explain after the dream, and I'm terrified for the reasons I will share later. It started with me going to a social group and talking to one girl. She asked for my contact information, and I found out that she knew him. I was curious and inquired. She talked about him in good light, but when I tried to chime in about her saying he was telling people I was crazy and had weird morning habits, she shut me down. Then I looked over and saw through the back of the class, his current or assumed to be ex now. I'll explain the backstory after this dream. The dream switched to me at work with my coworker. I'll call her Megan for this story purpose. Megan is known to not have a driver's license and every once in a while would have walked home before I worked there. But my other coworkers are like a close-knit community and refuse to let anyone walk home due to stalking and other dangerous situations that have occurred with staff in the past. In my dream, she was walking home on a dirt road for some reason, and a red car drove past her. There's dirt that clouds her after they drive by. From an outside perspective, I see my ex in the car with a few of his friends. They were the ones who drove past her with a cloud of smoke. They stopped to talk to her, and my dream cuts to us at my work asking where Megan is because she didn't show up for work. It could be from the true crime videos I've been watching lately, but I'm more worried about the meaning behind it. For some reason, my ex is there and I directly ask him where she is. He doesn't answer. Then my dream restarts completely to another location. I was asleep in my room when I felt my bedroom door was opening. My room layout in my apartment is the front door where the kitchen/living room connects, leading into the first bedroom, my mom's. Then straight through her room is mine with a door that you can just kick open, don't even have to twist the knob to open it. There's no hallway, and if we were ever attacked, slim chances of making it out alive because our windows barely squeeze past our shoulder. Sometimes my dreams rely on the situation and replay it slightly differently, but the outcomes are always the same. Someone in the dark was standing there. I grabbed a multi-tool pocket knife that my current boyfriend has given me in case of emergencies or when it's handy. I told him to leave because I knew who it was. Usually, I'm aware when I have nightmares about him, it's always about him. I opened the knife to the small blade and started asking him why he was there and to go away. I even tried bargaining with him that if he killed me, it was okay because my life was already miserable enough. He would start to try and jab me, but it didn't. Then the dream restarts. He's at the door, opens it, and waits until I wake up. It's dark, I grab the knife, and then I try and reach the lights by the door. He stabs me, and it restarts again. The door opens, and it's dark. Reach it open for the knife. This time open it behind my back and sneak my phone to press the power button 3 times to alarm the police and my contacts. He tried to stab me, and it restarted. Another time the same sequence, except it was him getting closer to me, and I slid the phone under my bed so the phone recorded what I was saying. Another time the same thing, but it was on my nightstand and I had called the police to listen by using the 3 presses of the power button. The second last time, this one changed twice. My light was on and I saw a shadow from my bedroom window pass by. So I did what you are instructed to do during a code red, farthest from windows and the door from hiding in a corner of my small room. The door opens, and he walks towards me with his knife in hand. I think this is the end. I tried reasoning with him, telling him that he was acting like his exes before him in an abusive manner to me when we were dating. I'm afraid his anger burst. The dream moves forward, and I try to move past him after he drops his knife. Then I realized he brought a friend with him, most likely. For this purpose, I'll say his name is Adam. Adam waits over my mom's bed to try and grab me since it's right by my bedroom door. For one last time, is the same outcome with this change, but instead of Adam hiding by my door, my closet was slightly ajar. I always close my closet because I'm a paranoid person as it is, so I knew something was off. The dream ends because I wake up to hear a girl talking and it sounds close to my house entrance. I panicked and woke up. My lights were left on from when I fell asleep after watching videos of reviews and a true crime about the Kennedy family. After the girl stopped talking, it felt like a shadow of a car crept by, so I shut off my lights to feel safer, like I was hiding. I tossed and turned for an hour and even woke up with the thought of messaging one of my ex's other friends, I'll name as Devin. Couldn't follow him because he had a private account, so I got curious and searched my ex's name and found the account, but I didn't have the balls to click on the account, so it stayed in my search history. That's when I had the idea to write this here, because I don't know who else to message this late at night. I have work in the morning, but I have done this before where I wake up from a nightmare. After a few hours, I fall asleep again to videos to calm me and I'll be recharged. But what freaks me out the most is I saw my ex a few days ago without a dream, big whoop. But almost every time without fail I have a nightmare about him and he's around town with his friend Adam by his side. I went to a local trail for a date. Things aren't what they seem here. I made the mistake of sending a risky message several drinks deep on a Saturday night. An ex I dated for 3 years, Claire, was recently divorced and I'd been trying to work up the courage to reach out. Instead of doing this in a pre-planned, calculated way, I pulled the Hail Mary out of randomly messaging and asking how she'd been. I immediately regretted my choice, panicking as I heard my phone chime. Surprisingly, her response was positive. She let me know she's been better, but was doing all right. She seemed open to having a conversation, and we continued to text until I passed out early in the morning. The next day, I woke up, my head pounding and feeling dehydrated. I quickly remembered having a conversation with Claire, but couldn't recall the details. I looked at my messages. I felt embarrassed at how much I stumbled over my words. It was clear I was nervous about talking to her again. In my drunken state, I worked up the courage to ask her out. Surprisingly, she agreed and we were to meet at a local trail that night around 7. I did remember her being pretty outdoorsy, so this suggestion made sense. Although I wasn't looking forward to a hike in the heat while hungover, I was very much looking forward to reconnecting with Claire. I knew she hadn't been divorced long, so I wasn't sure what she was looking for, but I was glad I was at least getting a chance to see her again after all these years. I met up with Claire at the trail as planned. I recognized her silver Honda immediately. She stepped out wearing a pair of cargo shorts and hiking boots. Despite it being 5 years since I saw her last, she didn't look a day over 21. Her shoulder-length blonde hair looked bright as ever and her green eyes lit up the room, just like I remembered. "Hey Aiden," said Claire, hugging me. I didn't have liquid courage backing me up anymore, so I was extremely nervous. We began walking and luckily, the conversation was easy. Claire didn't talk much about her ex-husband, thankfully. She seemed to be enjoying her post-divorce life. She recently moved to a townhouse and got a new dog, a yellow lab named Baxter. She also told me she left nursing to pursue graphic design like she always wanted. I remembered the arguments with her family when she started college. They put a lot of pressure on her to go into the medical field instead of anything creative. "I'm glad you're finally doing what's right for you," I told her. Claire nodded. At some point, the conversation shifted to heavier topics, particularly her brother's overdose a few years ago. I apologized to her for not attending the funeral. She was very understanding. We settled into a comfortable silence, taking in the scenery. The landscape of the trail was a beautiful mix of woods and prairie. "When do you want to start heading back?" I asked. It was almost 8 now and would be getting dark soon. Claire didn't respond. I wondered if she heard me. I figured she'd tell me when she was ready, and I wanted to spend as much time with her as possible, so I didn't ask again. I noticed we were past the parts of the trail I was familiar with. The trail led us over a hill. When we got to the other side, I noticed the landscape looked different. Despite being in Ohio, it looked like Washington State Park. Dramatic, tall pine trees lined the landscape, some covered in moss. The tree line was so dense we were comfortably covered in shade. I paused and looked around. Claire kept up her usual pace, barely seeming to notice. I was surprised. I never heard how scenic this part of the trail was. "Damn, this is incredible," I commented, hoping to make conversation. Me and Claire talked about taking a trip to Washington many times during our relationship, but never took the plunge. I was always really sad we never got the chance to go. I thought about going on a road trip with friends, but it felt strange to go without her. Claire nodded and continued walking. I paused to take some pictures. Claire didn't stop to wait for me or even slow down. This kind of annoyed me, but I caught up to her, eager to see more of this section of the trail. We continued walking in silence. The beautiful tree line continued for a good 15 minutes, then seemed to gradually revert to the normal Ohio landscape. I didn't know what to say at this point. It was clear that Claire didn't want to talk right now. Yet, she also didn't seem interested in concluding the hike either. I didn't like the mixed signals. I decided to give her some time before trying to start a conversation. The trees and tall prairie grass seemed to gradually thin out as we continued down the trail. The ground beneath appeared dry and cracked. Eventually, we reached an area that looked like a barren desert landscape. There were even cacti, which, as anyone in the Midwest knows, don't grow here naturally. "What the hell?" I whispered. I finally broke the silence. "Did you know this was here?" I asked Claire. "I didn't, but it reminds me of our trip to Arizona," she said, smiling. I thought back to the trip, smiling to myself. We took the trip our last year together. Even though we were on the rocks at that point, we got along great during the trip, and I thought it would be like a new beginning. Unfortunately, things didn't stay the same once we returned home. I snapped back into reality. I didn't understand how a landscape could change so rapidly. How were plants for a desert climate even able to survive here? Claire was barely reacting to our strange surroundings. I started to worry about her. She seemed despondent. I worried that maybe this was too much for her. It wasn't long after her divorce, after all. It also wasn't like she was reconnecting with an old fling we dated long-term and had a messy breakup. I couldn't even remember the details of what that final argument was about. All I remember was watching her leave and feeling more powerless than I have in my entire life. Eventually, the desert-like landscape gave way to the Ohio landscape I was more familiar with. I stopped for a moment to try to look up the trail to see how far it went. I tried for several minutes, but was unable to get cell service. By the time I looked up, Claire was so far ahead I couldn't see her. I was annoyed at this point. Why would she just ignore me when she agreed to come here with me? It was also getting dark at this point, and I was ready to call it a night. I quickly headed up the trail to find Claire. There was a large pond with some trees and a bench surrounding it. The path appeared to end here. "Claire," I yelled, looking around. Claire snuck up behind me, causing me to jump. "What the?" I was cut off by Claire's unexpected kiss. She then took my hand and led me to the edge of the pond. She began taking off her clothes as she dipped her feet in the water. "Want to get in?" she asked, winking. I couldn't believe my luck. Maybe this date was turning around. I stripped down to my boxers and followed her into the water. We kissed again. Claire then went underwater. I waited and she didn't come back up. I could barely see since it was almost dark now. I tried to feel around in the water for Claire. I couldn't find her. I began to panic. I held my breath and got underwater. I couldn't see, but as I swam around, I felt something touch me. I reached out and felt a hand grab onto mine. It must be Claire. I was trying to lead her to the surface when I realized the hand was pulling me downward. I pulled it up, but was immediately yanked back down. The grip on my hand tightened. I struggled to get free, almost breathing in water. Then, I heard a strange noise through the water. It almost sounded like hissing, or maybe growling. My arm flew up as I shot up to the surface in fear. Something grazed my back and I jumped. I turned around to see a human arm, decaying and detached from the body. It even had a bone sticking out the end. I screamed and ran out of the water, falling and tripping over rocks. I began hyperventilating. I called Claire several times, but got no response. Had that creepy thing in the water gotten her? I found my phone and dialed 911. Surprisingly, I got a signal. I frantically talked to the operator, begging them to get someone out there as soon as possible. Officers and an ambulance arrived soon after. The first officer who arrived on the scene asked for my ID, and I showed it to him. He glanced at it and then back at me. He asked me if I could come with him to the station to answer some questions. I didn't know how to tell him what happened without sounding out of my mind. I was happy to help, but wanted to know if Claire was okay first. He was honest with me that he couldn't give me an answer yet, but would tell me as soon as he knew. I rode with him back to the station, and he stepped out for a few minutes to take a call. His facial expression was noticeably different when he returned. "How did you know Claire?" he asked. I explained to him that we dated our senior year of high school and the first 2 years after. He asked why we broke up. I sat and thought for a moment. Embarrassingly enough, I couldn't remember the exact reason, just that we grew apart. I told him that. He nodded. "Did she talk to you at all about her divorce?" he asked. I shrugged. "Not really. I didn't think it was my place to ask. Maybe she was still in love with me," I joked. The officer didn't seem to think it was funny. I apologized. The officer asked some strange questions like where I grew up and what I did for work. Finally, I got frustrated and stopped him. "Did they find Claire?" I asked. He tried to avoid the question, but I insisted. The officer sighed and began talking. "Trevor, Claire's been missing for days now. Her high school ex, Aiden, was found dead in his apartment a few hours ago, but his phone, wallet, and several other items were missing. It appeared to be a robbery. But then we found out you made threats to him several months ago. You and Claire were divorcing, and you assumed it was because she was still in love with him. Phone records show that messages went to Claire from Aiden's phone at a time that was after his time of death. You lured Claire out to the trail, then murdered her and tossed her body in the pond. For whatever reason, you dressed up in some of Aiden's clothes tonight and called us as him. You must be feeling guilty. Why don't you go ahead and just tell me what happened?" I started shaking. The officer told me to think back a few days, and I did. I was drinking. I was alone. I looked at Claire's profile from a fake account I made. She blocked me immediately after our divorce was finalized. She posted a gorgeous selfie. Tons of thirsty, pathetic guys liked it. I clicked to see the names. Aiden, of course, had. I knew she still had feelings for him. Sometimes I didn't blame her. It's hard to lose feelings for an old flame. That said, I hated hearing about him. When we were moving into our marital home, I found some hand-painted terracotta pots in one of her boxes. She snatched them away from me as I unpacked them. I kept asking where they were from, and she finally caved. Apparently, she and Aiden painted them during their trip to Arizona. Why she would insult me by still having them, I don't know. Sitting at home alone, I fixated on Aiden more and more. I already knew where he lived. I'd figured this out months ago. I'd also figured out his routine. The guy was pretty predictable after all. I watched outside while his lights turned off for the night that Saturday. I entered his apartment with the spare key I had paid to have made by the sketchy maintenance guy. The sedatives I'd laced into Aiden's water jug were working. He didn't stir as I walked into his room. I opened his phone. I knew he and Claire were having an affair long before the divorce. Shockingly, there weren't any messages between them during our marriage. That didn't mean anything, though. I could feel it in my bones that Claire still loved him. I began messaging Claire as Aiden. She quickly agreed to meet up with him that night. I knew it. He's the reason I lost my Claire. Eventually, Aiden began to stir, making me uneasy. With the help of a phone charger, I made sure he never moved again. Claire looked shocked when she saw me get out of Aiden's truck, wearing his clothes. "What the hell?" she asked. "Isn't this who you wanted tonight?" "I'm just being who you wanted all along," I responded. "Where's Aiden?" "You crazy," she shouted. I don't remember what happened next, or maybe I just blocked it out. All I remember is walking back from the pond, clothes wet, and my face and arms scratched and bloody. The officer snapped me back into reality, asking why I returned on Saturday. The thing is, I couldn't tell him. It was like I was in a trance, living a life that wasn't mine. The officer placed me under arrest. I still couldn't figure out why I went back. In an empty corner of the room, I saw her. Claire. She was dripping wet, her hair and clothes dirty, and a creepy smile on her face. I stepped back, pointing, and the officer appeared confused. After I started screaming, I heard him call for backup. I was injected with something. My eyes became heavy and I closed them. I could still see Claire with my eyes closed. Never drive this New Mexico highway at night. I was on an assignment for the Army, making my way up from San Antonio, Texas, to Tacoma, Washington. It was a long drive, and they gave me 6 days to report to my new unit, but I didn't mind. I love road trips. There's nothing like the freedom of exploring the world by yourself. On the first day of my journey, I planned to get as much driving in as possible so I could spend a few days in Utah, a sort of mini vacation, you could say. This was January, and the days were short, so maximizing the amount of daylight I had was crucial. I got up extra early that morning, carried the last of my bags out to my Corolla, signed out of my old unit, and hit the road at roughly 5 a.m. It was an amazing day. I saw the landscape transform around me as I headed farther west than I had ever been in my life. From the San Antonio metropolitan area to the savannas of the Edwards Plateau, to the pancake flat farmland of the Great Plains region, America's breadbasket. Finally, the farms opened up into prairie, and I saw the "Welcome to New Mexico, the land of enchantment" sign. Now I was really in the middle of nowhere. Continuing on US Route 380, I eventually found myself in Roswell. I could have gotten a few more hours of driving in and made it to Albuquerque, but I figured since I was in no rush, I might as well see what Roswell had to offer. Who knows if I would get a chance to visit again. As a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, as Mr. Ballin would say, I took a self-guided tour of the shops and attractions. The next day, I continued to Albuquerque, then westward on Interstate 40. By the time I reached Gallup and started northbound on US Route 491, I still had 2 hours of driving left before crossing the border into Colorado, and another 45 minutes before I would get to Cortez, my planned stop for the night. However, my daylight was already running out, as sunset was at 6 p.m. I got Starbucks and refreshed myself for the final stretch. It was supposed to be easy. Just a straight shot. But looking back on it now, I figured that, had I decided to stop in Albuquerque instead of Roswell the night previous, I would have already been in Colorado by now, and possibly be making my way into Utah. I would have saved myself from what was waiting for me on that desolate highway. Route 491 stretched far into the Navajo Nation. On either side of me were endless expanses of prairie bookended by dark indigo mountains on the horizon. To my left, the sky glowed a faint orange-purple, the light slowly dying down like smoldering embers in a fire, until finally plunging the land into darkness. Now and then, I would see the forlorn headlights of another car passing by, which gave me a bit of relief that I wasn't alone. I also had my road trip playlist on to keep me company, and call me ironic, but Hotel California was playing. After passing the small, lonely town of Newcomb, the next piece of civilization would be Shiprock. However, between the two was a 36-mile stretch of absolute nothingness. An abyss I had to cross. I was not ready for what I was about to witness. After several miles, and having not seen another car on the road, I saw something strange emerge from the horizon. Barely lit by the moonlight, I thought it was a road sign at first. Then as I came closer, I realized it was a person, walking on the shoulder of the road, heading in my direction. I squinted, trying my hardest to focus on the figure. In the darkness, I could tell they were wearing a poncho of some sort, with long, black hair flowing down past their chest. Who could be walking out here, all alone, at night? I thought. Whoever it was, they had no lights, no reflectors, no strobes of any kind to signal to passing cars that they were there. And they walked on the pavement, dangerously close to oncoming traffic. I pulled to the left a bit, giving them a wide berth. Suddenly, my stereo cut out, as if I had turned it off. The screen went completely dark, and my phone disconnected from Bluetooth. While this was unusual, it certainly did happen from time to time, so I thought nothing of it. As I approached, I saw the person raise their right arm, as if to flag me down and hitch a ride. Oh no, I thought. No way's happening, buddy. As my headlights swept by, I realized it was a man, dressed in a button-up shirt, a wool poncho, jeans, and cowboy boots. His large belt buckle glinted as the lights passed him. But in that split second, I realized with abject shock that not only were his eyes painfully wide open, but they seemed to be tracking me. Somehow, he was able to see me through the glare of my headlights and look me dead in the eyes, not breaking contact until I passed. I was shaken for a bit, but my nerves gradually subsided. My stereo abruptly turned back on and my music continued playing. I brushed everything off as simply my imagination. The darkness and the shadows played tricks on my mind. Besides, the man was behind me. I figured he must have been drunk. Indian reservations sadly had high rates of alcoholism. I looked in my rearview mirror. He was gone. I couldn't see him. Maybe he's too far behind me? No, that couldn't be. It must be too dark. Maybe. I drove on, trying to figure out what had just happened, but at the same time, forcing myself not to think about it. Just when I thought I had moved on, I saw another shape in the distance. Getting closer, I realized it was another figure. Is another person walking alone at night? There's no way. They walked along the shoulder of the road, swaying back and forth. Slowly, I could make out that this person was also wearing a poncho. Then I saw what looked like long, black hair, reaching down past the chest. No. There's no way. It was the man. The same man. But how? The man raised his arm again, trying to flag me down. What did this guy want? I kept up my pace, with no intention of stopping for any reason. Just like last time, my stereo turned off again. Suddenly, the man leaped out onto the road, arms waving frantically. I swerved into the left lane, narrowly avoiding him. In my headlights, I noticed he had the same wide-eyed look, his gaze locked onto mine. I also saw that his clothes did not look as they did in the first encounter. Once they were clean, if not well-worn, but now they were soiled and tattered, rags barely hanging onto his withered frame. His hair was wild and unkempt, with clods of dried dirt stuck in the locks. But his eyes remained the same. My heart nearly burst through my chest at the sudden shock. Hyperventilating, I slowed down and glanced into the rearview mirror to make sure he was all right. Nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see. The man was running. He was sprinting towards me. I centered the wheel and accelerated, hoping to get as much distance from him as possible. But as I continued to speed up, so did he. Faster and faster I drove, but every time I looked in the mirror, I would still see him right behind me, perfectly keeping pace, his body tinted red by my tail lights. I could feel my temples throbbing and my hands getting slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I was sick to my stomach. There's no way. I looked forward, hoping to see a faint glimmer of light from the town ahead. But I was still too far away. I looked back at the rearview mirror. The man was gone. I should have been relieved, but I knew better. Where did he go? I looked around, hoping to regain a visual of him. I couldn't see anything. Taking a deep breath, I refocused on the road but kept my guard up. Just keep driving, I told myself. Only a few more miles to go. Out of the corner of my right eye, I saw something. Another shape. It wasn't the man, at least, I didn't think so. I glanced over, bracing myself for whatever was going to meet my sight. It looked like an animal. Some kind of animal, though I couldn't make out exactly what it was. Under the moonlight, I could see it running alongside my car, its forelimbs reaching out in long strides, its back undulating like a dog. Closer and closer it came. The closer it was, the more of it I could see. Little by little. Then I noticed its limbs were far too long for its body. Its body was too short. It had no tail. The head was oddly round. And from it came a trail of long, black hair. I slammed my foot on the gas, pushing my car's engine harder than it had ever been pushed before. By now I was clocking well over 110 miles per hour. But this creature, it kept up. It wasn't phased. It simply ran faster and faster to match my speed. Just what was this thing? How could anyone or anything run this fast? The entity seemed to have endless stamina. Just how long could it keep this up? Just how much faster could it go? Soon, my car would hit its top speed. And then what? How long could it maintain that before breaking down? It wouldn't be long until my engine overheats. But regardless, I would eventually run out of gas. And when I do, what would happen if that thing got me? At 120 miles per hour, my car had reached its limit. This was the fastest I could go. But the creature continued its pursuit. My temperature gauge was approaching the red, and so was my tachometer. I couldn't keep this up any longer. Suddenly, like the beacon of a lighthouse on a tumultuous sea, the first light of Shiprock came into view. It was close. So close. If I could just go a little longer, I could make it into town. To safety. I pressed on. I fixed my eyes on the lights, growing brighter on the horizon. They bloomed outwards, glimmering in the night air. Though it was a small town, it was a sight for sore eyes in my situation. Looking in my periphery, I saw the undulation of the creature's spine as it kept pace with my car. But now, it was slipping away, steering farther and farther from the road. It suddenly hit me just how hard my heart was beating. Beads of sweat dripped down my face. I looked over. The creature was gone. But this time, the feeling of dread had also gone with it. My stereo once again turned back on, and as my music resumed, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. I let off the accelerator. The creature, whatever it was finally gone for good. Having white-knuckled the steering wheel the whole time without realizing it, my hands were extremely sore. But I was glad to have made it through. A week later, I told another soldier in my unit about what I had experienced. Being originally from Albuquerque, she was familiar with the Native American legends of the Southwest. The conversation steered toward a certain creature that she would not dare speak the name of. She also told me that the highway I took was well known for all sorts of paranormal phenomena. Google what Route 491 used to be called, and everything will make sense. Be careful out there. I worked at a 24-hour gas station and had some unsettling encounters. I was there for 3 years. The station had an auto shop attached, but was rarely needed at night, so I typically just dealt with people coming for gas. Occasionally, I'd be asked to work on a car overnight from the day shift. One time, I found several bags of heroin leaking out from the driver SR seat. I was nervous the owners would know I saw it, so I stuffed the bags back in. The station was out on a country road, so the types of customers I generally served were truckers, farmers, or the random couple driving home from a date. However, there were anomalies. The car accidents. The drunk driver killed a small family in the intersection out front. There was a vicious, blazing inferno coming out of that minivan. The dad made it out, but he was on fire and died in the middle of the road. One time I served gas to someone who was being chased by the police. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. I just thought the driver was in a hurry. I was robbed at gunpoint, twice. It was the same two ski mask guys too. They just took turns speaking between the two incidents. Then there was the time an old guy drove up, got out of his car, and died of a heart attack 2 steps later. Those incidents were normal, or at least understandable, explainable. But there was one night something unexplainable happened. It was shortly after 3 a.m. Headlights drove in carrying a 1966 Pontiac Bonneville 2-door coupe. A thin trail of smoke was coming from under the hood. The inside of the windows were all fogged up, so I couldn't really see the interior of the car or the occupants. The car drove past the gas station and right into the auto shop. The lights weren't even on inside the shop, but the headlights lit it up. I went to greet the driver and flipped on the overhead lights of the shop, but they came on weak and dim. The driver's side door opened as I approached, and I was immediately hit with a stench of old, damp cloth and dust. A middle-aged man got out uneasily like his knees were made of twigs. He wore one of those black Quaker hats with dark hair spiking from under it and a graying goatee. The man's face was covered in lines and wrinkles, and his eyes sunk back into his head. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Check the oil. Check the engine," he choked out and walked past me, fumbling out an old box of matches. The passenger door closed and a middle-aged woman stood there. She had thick, dark hair that looked like it was greased through with gel and matted to her head. An uneven set of bangs cut across her forehead. The woman carried the same sunken eyes as the man, but her face was covered in days-old makeup. Rosy cheeks, blue eyeliner, red lipstick. Even through the smearing, you could tell it was applied with heavy exaggeration. Then the woman smiled at me. I wish she hadn't. Her teeth were dirty orange and speckled with black dots. Her gums were dark gray. I noticed she only had the front 6 teeth on her upper and lower jaws. She didn't appear to have any molars, which I shouldn't know, but she couldn't stop smiling to reveal that. The moment the woman saw me, her lips had stretched into a wide-mouthed grin that curved downward like a catfish. It was a strange and frightening smile, like it was pulled and stretched over a screaming face. The woman began speaking to me, but she spoke so softly I couldn't hear her. I kept leaning forward, trying to get a better ear. But the closer I got, the further her voice sounded. Then I realized we were inches from each other's faces. Her breath was rancid as she spoke, and I finally heard what she was saying. "Don't go in the car." The woman pulled back and I saw the scream behind the smile in her eyes. She was terrified. Joan. The driver was already outside the auto shop, lighting up a dirty-looking home-rolled cigarette. The woman, Joan, followed him. She looked back, continuing to smile, but her eyes told a story of desperation and horror. They gave me chills, and I was happy the two were going to wait outside. I watched the strange couple walk down to the edge of the gas station where it made up the corner of a quiet, country intersection. I turned to the car, not really sure what to do. After I couldn't get under the hood, I figured there was a release latch under the steering wheel. I went to the driver's side door and saw the window was down. I leaned in through the window and searched and fumbled until I found the latch. I flicked it open and saw the hood pop up. As I was pulling myself out, a thought struck me that the window was up when the man drove in. It was up when he walked off. How did it get down? Then my eyes caught the rearview mirror. And what was in the back seat? There was a little boy staring at me. He sat calmly in the middle seat with his seatbelt still on. He had a strange, swirling facial scar that reminded me of a boy I went to grade school with named Johnny Watkins. He'd been attacked by a dog when he was little and large portions of his face were horrendously scarred. That's what this boy looked like. And he had something that looked like mud and dirt smeared around his mouth and chin. The same smears were on his hands and wrists. The boy wore old, dirty overalls and a flannel shirt underneath. His eyes were locked on me. They carried an accusatory glare like he was catching me stealing. I quickly blurted out, "Hey buddy, just checking out the engine, then we'll get you and your parents on their way." The boy stared back, his brow furrowed down at the center, angrily. "They're not my parents," he croaked out. Then he started to make a strange sound. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but then it became clear. The boy was laughing in his own, odd way. It was like his breath was hitching up repeatedly during the inhale. I didn't know what to do or say, so I pulled myself out of the window and made my way to the hood. I looked out and saw Joan and the man were still at the corner, smoking and arguing. I popped the hood up and was greeted with a cloud of smoke. I figured it was a motor oil spill or leak at first. Then I stared down at the engine and I had no idea what to make of it. It looked foreign but also homemade. It was all connected and had metal plates fastened around it, protecting parts of the wiring and cables, so it was next to impossible to see what was wrong. I honestly didn't know what the hell I was looking at. But I managed to find what looked like a small handle for a dipstick, and I twisted and pulled it out. It was for the oil. I cleaned it, put it back in, and pulled it to inspect. Basically dry. The little oil at the end felt gritty. It needed a change. The car was parked over our lift, so I didn't have to get in to move it. But I couldn't leave the kid in there. He had to get out. Safety precautions and all. I went to the driver's side window, but the window was up again. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I went over to the passenger side and found it locked too. I peered in through the dirty windows to try to signal to the boy to open the door. But the back seat was empty. The car was empty. He was gone. The only explanation I could come up with was that the back seats of the car pulled down and allowed access to the trunk. So I checked the trunk, but it was also locked. I knocked on it, trying to get the boy's attention if he was inside. But nothing came back. I looked outside but couldn't see Joan or the man. I was confused and nervous, and all I could think to do was explain that our lift wasn't working, so they'd need to get their oil changed at another shop in the next few days. Then I'd send them on their way. A loud clunk made me jump. On the other side of the garage, a loose wrench was on the ground. I walked over to it and picked it up. It had a small, child-sized muddy handprint on it. And suddenly, that odd laugh echoed out from somewhere in the garage. I raised the wrench to swing, but there was nothing to swing at. The loud, metal rattling of the front, retracting door slamming shut made me yell. I went over to inspect the now shut door, but as I did, the retracting metal doors at the back slammed shut as well. At this point, I figured the kid was messing with me, so I called out to him, telling him playtime was over and to come on out. Then the power went out. The garage was completely black. Not a single window could be seen. I tried to open the front metal gate, but it wouldn't budge. Like it was welded shut. More metal tools clanged against the ground. One slammed against the metal door, right beside my head. And another. The boy's hitched laughter croaked out from somewhere in the dark of the shop. I couldn't see anything but knew the layout of the garage inside out and backward. There was a flashlight on the far end of the wall to my right. There were shelves along the wall and a wide workbench I could follow. I moved along the metal door to the wall and found the edge of the bench. The boy's laughter got louder, echoing through the garage. It stopped sounding human though. It was more hyena-like. And the source of the laughter was getting closer to me. With it, I felt a hot, rotten breath assaulting my nostrils. It followed me along the bench and towards the end of the wall. Through laughing, the boy quietly repeated, "I'm gonna find you, I'm gonna find you." My foot hit what felt like a ratchet wrench, which loudly skittered across the metal grating on the floor. "Was that you?" the boy squealed out. Realizing I still had the wrench in my hands I first picked up, I threw it across the garage, hoping to hit the back wall and cause a distraction. It left my hand, but it never landed. "There you are," the voice called out through laughs. Something shuffled behind me. I hit the end of the bench and reached up, knocking over multiple tools and causing a series of loud crashes. But I didn't care. I felt the flashlight grip and turned it on, spinning and pointing the light behind me. I wished I hadn't. The boy was 2 feet from me. I only saw his face for a moment, but that was enough. The boy's facial scar had unraveled, like layers of extra skin in some strange face scarf covering. Only the fleshy layers were actually attached to him and contained rows of needle-like teeth on the inside. When the skin flap opened, it tripled the original diameter of his mouth. I screamed and fell backward. I expected to hit the ground and immediately have the boy's frightening mouth biting down on my face or neck. I hit the pavement outside the garage instead. The lights of the gas station poured over me. I looked back into the garage from my back. The lights were on. The metal door was open. The Bonneville was still and silent. Windows closed and clear. Footsteps approached from behind me. I scrambled up and turned to see Joan, and the man had returned. He flicked his cigarette butt and approached me and mumbled how much. I couldn't speak. My lower jaw moved, but all I could stammer out was, "Don't worry about it." The man shrugged and walked back to the car. I turned and found Joan there, staring up at me. She was whispering something quickly and repeatedly. I leaned in and heard it clearly. "You shoulda listened, you shoulda listened, you shoulda listened." The man called out from the car, snapping Joan back to him. Still smiling, Joan shook her head at me, tears rolling down her cheeks in dark smears. She walked back to the car and got in. The Bonneville started up and drove past me. The windows were no longer blurred by fog, so I could see inside clearly. I saw the man staring straight ahead. Joan, sitting passenger beside him, smiled out at me with worried eyes. Then I saw the back seat. It was empty. The boy was gone. I was so afraid, I locked the garage and the gas station, checked my car, then got in and drove for an hour before stopping. I called my boss and told him I was violently ill and had to lock up early. He was less than impressed, but I didn't care. I couldn't go back there. And I didn't. I gave my 2 weeks and called in sick for each shift. I never went back to the garage and tried to avoid gas stations at night now. But it's not just that. Now, whenever I hear someone laugh, I hear the boys laugh. That same odd upward hitch. No matter the person, every giggle or cackle comes out the same. And sometimes it turns into that higher-pitched hyena cackle. It's been happening more and more. It feels like one of those flus that start slow and take their time weakening your immune system before leveling you. Then tonight happened. I came home and there was a small, muddy handprint on the door handle of my apartment. There was one on the inside too.